students, welcome to the lecture on trade unions. And after this lecture, we will be able to learn the following objectives. Define the concept of trade union. Explain the history of trade union. Describe the labor and trade union movement. Describe trade union law in India. Explain the privileges of registered trade union. Explain trade dispute. Let's start with the introduction of trade union. The Trade Union Act defines a trade union as a combination, whether temporary or permanent, formed primarily for the purposes of regulating the relations between workmen and employers, or between workmen and workmen, or between employers and employers, or for imposing restrictive condition on the conduct of any trade or business, and includes any federation of two or more trade unions. Trade unionism is a worldwide movement, and the highly strategic position occupied by trade unions in modern industrial society has been widely recognized. In most cases, employees' associations or trade unions seem to have emerged as protest movements reaching against the working relationships and condition created by industrialization.
British trade unions have often been described as having a labourist ethos. What does this mean exactly? Well, it means that they are models of constitutional propriety, traditionally deeply ambivalent about political involvement. The use of industrial power in the UK for political ends has traditionally been seen as illegitimate. This originates in a fear of legal restraint, a concern for the unity of the trade union movement, and the fact that the Labour Party exists. In addition, British trade unions are labourist insofar as they have generally confined themselves to demands founded upon members' economic interests. Typically, they have sought better wages and improved conditions of work for their members. One consequence of this has been that the trade unions and the Labour parties have generally sought to ensure that there is a clear demarcation of industrial and political spheres, which has been jealously guarded. And as we'll see in the lecture, throughout much of the post-war period, this has meant that free collective bargaining and the voluntary legal framework have been regarded as sacrosanct by the trade unions. A further characteristic of British trade unionism is its complex and fragmented organisation. Historically, we've been able to identify several different types of trade unions. There have been craft unions representing skilled workers, for example the engineers and the electricians would fall into this category. There have been general and industrial unions like the Transport and General Workers Union and the National Union of Mine Workers. And then in addition to those there have been white collar and professional unions such as the National Union of Teachers and unions like unionism. Historically, this has meant that bargaining and decision-making structures were diffuse, since often many different unions were representing the workforce of a single company. This fragmentation and complex organisation reflects the evolution of British trade unionism. It meant that control of the members by the leadership of unions was often difficult, and this manifested itself in a significant level of unofficial strikes for much of the post-war period. Another point that we need to recognise as emerging from this fragmented organisation is that different unions often had different interests. For example, unions representing the low paid generally favoured incomes policies. Those representing highly paid workers tended to favour free collective bargaining. We also need to recognise the role of the Trade Union Congress. The Trade Union Congress is a federation of trade unions. While it doesn't include all trade unions, the vast majority of trade unionists are members of unions which are affiliated to the TUC. It seeks to draw up common policies and campaigns on behalf of its members. However, the TUC has little power over its affiliates, and this was to have a number of consequences for trade unions in the British state during the post-war period, which we'll explore in more depth in the lecture. Finally, I think it's important that we get some sense of the key trends in the post-war union movement. The period of the post-war consensus was one of growing membership for British trade unions, as we can see on the graph on your screens. In 1945, trade union members were 7.9 million in number. By 1955, this had increased to 9.7, and membership reached its peak in the year of Margaret Thatcher's election. There were 13.2 million members of trade unions in 1979. However, by 1997 the unions had fewer members than at any time since 1945. The gains of the entire post-war period have been wiped out in the space of just 17 years. Since then, union membership has fluctuated a little but has stabilised overall. In 2008 there were 6.9 million members of trade unions. A further key trend in the post-war era is the declining number of trade unions. By 1945, there were 475 trade unions in Britain. But that has declined, particularly in recent years, as many smaller unions have been taken over by larger unions and mergers have occurred between the larger unions. So, for example, there has been the merger of the Amalgamated Engineering and Electrical Union and the Manufacturing Science and Finance Union in 2001 to form Amicus. The amalgamation of the Association of University Teachers and the National Association of Teachers in Further and Higher Education to form the University and College Lecturers Union in 2006. The merger of Amicus, itself the product of a merger as we've seen, and the Transport and General Workers Union to form Unite in 2007. Finally, it's worth getting a sense of the characteristics of present trade union members. What we can see here is that women are more highly unionised than men, and that unions are generally stronger in public sector workforces than in the private sector. Trade unions have also found it rather more difficult to organise part-time workers. Indeed, part-timers are still underrepresented in the union movement as a whole, and that trade unions also tend to be easier to organise in larger workplaces. The majority of trade unions trade unionists work in workplaces of 50 or more employees. That concludes what I want to say, just as a general prologue to our lecture on trade unions.
A trade union is an organization that is designed to function as an advocate and protector for workers engaged in a specific trade. This advocacy often takes the form of negotiating benefits and wage requirements for the members of the union, as well as lobbying state and federal governments for legislation that protects the rights of those workers. A trade union is also often concerned with the working conditions of its members, especially in relation to the safety of those conditions. Depending on the nature of the trade union, the leadership of the organization may also work with the employers and state officials on several other matters of concern to their members. A trade union will often maintain a lobby that represents the interests of its members in terms of new and existing laws. In this capacity, a union may work with members of specific political parties or lawmakers currently serving in the government to draft and support legislation that protects the rights of their constituency. Concepts. The term trade union has been defined in various ways because of wide differences in the use of this term in different countries. Of all the definitions of a trade union, the classic definition of the Webbs have been most popular. According to them, a trade union is a continuous association of wage earners for the purpose of maintaining or improving the condition of their working lives. In modern times, a trade union, with some modification, may be redefined as a continuous association of wage earners or salaried employees for maintaining the conditions of their working lives and ensuring them a better and healthier status in industry as well as in the society. The term organized labor is used to distinguish workers, employees, who are members of trade unions or employee association from those who are unorganized. Example, who are not members of any union. The term labor movement is generally applied to all the various types of long-term association of workers, employees that are formed in industrialized or industrializing economies. According to GDH code, labor movement implies, in some degree, a community of outlook. Thus, the labor movement in a country emerges from a common need to serve a common interest. It seeks to develop amongst employees a spirit of combination, class consciousness, and solidarity of interest, and generates a consciousness for self-respect, and creates organizations for their self-protection, safeguarding of their common interest, and betterment of their economic and social conditions. Theories. Trade unions are voluntary organization of workers formed to promote and protect their interests through collective action. Karl Marx. Class Conflict and Communist Manifesto. According to Marx, trade union is the natural income of capitalism. They perform a necessary and useful task in protecting wages and in proper working condition. They should not limit themselves to these goals. Rather, they should use their power to emancipate the working class by putting an end to the capitalist system. Marx believed that the labor movement was pure and simple trade union, with workers remaining subordinate to the owners of the industry. He emphasized a role for intellectual to imbue and inspire in workers a class and political consciousness, outside the economic struggle, and outside the sphere of relation between works and employers. Sidney and Beatrice Webb. The socialist pattern of society. The Webbs viewed the role of trade unions as moved in first winning economic benefits of the members. They saw a role for unions to socialism through political action. The Webbs too, like Marx, observed that the market pressure on workers to organize into unions to protect their economic interests. The condition of employment was determined by the chain of bargains that linked the manual worker, the capitalist employer, the wholesale trade, the shopkeeper, and the customer. Robert Hoxie. Unions under the American capitalist system. Robert Hoxie is among the earliest to have argued that unions evolved differently across social psychological environment context. His considers American unions less dogmatic and more pragmatic and opportunist. Trade union, also called labor union, association of laborers in a particular trade, industry, or company, created for the purpose of securing improvements in pay, benefits, working conditions, or social and political status through collective bargaining. Historical development. As an organized movement, trade unionism originated in the 19th century in Great Britain, continental Europe, and the United States. In many countries, it is synonymous with the term labor movement. Smaller associations of workers started appearing in Britain in the 18th century, but they remained sporadic and short-lived through most of the 19th century, in part because of the hostility they encountered from employers and government groups that resented this new form of political and economic activism. At that time, unions and unionists were regularly prosecuted under various restraint of trade and conspiracy statuses in both Britain and the United States. While union organizers in both countries faced similar obstacles, their approaches evolved quite differently. The British movement favored political activism, which led to the formation of the Labour Party in 1906, while American unions pursued collective bargaining as a means of winning economic gains for their workers. Legal precedents. British unionism received its legal foundation in the Trade Union Act. In the United States, the same effect was achieved, albeit more slowly and uncertainly, by a series of court decisions that whittled away at the use of injunctions, conspiracy laws, and other devices against unions. In 1866, the formation of the National Labor Union, NLU, represented an early attempt to create a federation of American unions. Modern developments. During the 20th century, craft unions lost ground to industrial unions. This shift was both historic and controversial because the earliest unions had developed in order to represent skilled workers. These groups believed that unskilled workers were unsuitable for union organization. In 1935, for example, the AFL opposed attempts to organize the unskilled and ultimately expelled a small group of member unions that were attempting to do so. The expelled unions formed the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, which by 1941 had assured the success of industrial unionism by organizing the steel and automobile industries. When the AFL and the CIO emerged in 1955, they represented between them some 15 million workers. At the same time, mass unions began appearing in Britain and several European countries. And before the end of the century, the industrial unions embracing large numbers of unskilled or semi-skilled workers were recognized as powerful negotiating forces. By the end of the 20th century, the globalization of the workforce had brought new challenges to the labor movement, effectively weakening collective bargaining in industries whose workers could be replaced by a cheaper labor force in a different part of the world. Some features of trade unions are: it is an association either of employers or employees or of independent workers. They may consist of A. Employers Association, B. General labor unions, C. Friendly societies, D. Unions of intellectual labor. It is formed on a continuous basis. It is a permanent body and not a casual or temporary one. They persist throughout the year. It is formed to protect and promote all kinds of interests: economic, political and social of its members. The dominant interest with which a union is concerned is, however, economic. It achieves its objectives through collective action and group effort. Negotiations and collective bargaining are the tools for accomplishing objectives. Leadership issues. Another disquieting feature of the trade unions is the outside leadership. Example, leadership of trade unions by persons who are professional politicians and lawyers, and who have no history of physical work in the industry. There are several reasons for this phenomenon, namely, the rank and the file are largely illiterate, as such they cannot effectively communicate with the management. For avoiding victimization of worker office bearers of the trade unions, and for lack of financial resources to appoint whole-time office bearers. Agency shop. An agency shop is a workplace where both union and non-union workers may be present, and non-union workers are required to pay a fee to compensate the union for representing their interests. The assumption is that in workplaces where a union is active, people not in the union receive benefits and could be considered freeloaders if they are not providing compensation to the union. The fees paid by non-union employees are known as agency fees, and they are set by the union during collective bargaining with the employer. Some workplaces favor the agency shop model because it theoretically allows employees to choose whether they want to belong to a union, unlike a closed shop where everyone must join the union in order to work. One of the main reasons of workers joining a trade union been their belief to get wages increased and maintained at a reasonable standard through collective action, and the realization that individual bargaining was utterly useless for this purpose. Needs. Need of trade union are: reason of employees joining some union may be the broader realization on their part that unions fulfill the important need for adequate machinery for proper maintenance of labor management relations. Employees may join the unions because of their belief that it is an effective way to secure adequate protection from various types of hazards, and income insecurity such as accident injury, illness, unemployment, etc. The employees may join the unions because of their feeling that this would enable them to communicate their views, ideas, feelings, and frustrations to the management effectively. Individuals may join the unions in the hope of finding a job through their influence in the company management. Functions. Trade unions perform a number of functions in order to achieve the objectives. These functions can be broadly classified into two categories. 1. Militant functions. 2. Fraternal functions. Militant functions. The militant functions of trade unions can be summed up as 1. To achieve higher wages and better working conditions. 2. To raise the status of workers as a part of industry. 3. To protect laborers against victimization and injustice. Fraternal functions. The fraternal functions of trade unions can be summed up as to take up welfare measures for improving the morale of workers, to generate self-confidence among workers, to encourage sincerity and discipline among workers, to provide opportunities for promotion and growth, to protect women workers against discrimination. The union's first aim is to get control of all the labor force in the market and to minimize competition among workers. Every labor federation aims to extend its control to every branch of its trade. A sense of wrong is one of the strongest forces to bring the workers into the organization. The appeal to a common interest is effective in times of great grievance, as it was effective in the dangerous times of the American Revolution, though failing during the Confederation. One's opinion of trade unions is likely to differ according as they work in one or the other of these ways. The impartial onlooker sympathizes with the efforts of the trade unions insofar as they serve merely to put the workers on equality with the employers in bargaining. The public wants to see fair play, and up to a certain point the union is merely devised to get fair play. But if the union is a device to defeat competition, to force artificially high wages, it will be judged differently. The public readily sees that if the unions force more than a fair and open market affords, it is rarely at the expense of the employer. That in the long run, it is at the expense of the purchasing public itself, including the unprivileged workmen shut out from the monopoly of labor. In order to accomplish their ends, the trade unions seek to control their employers' business in various ways. They demand first that no non-union men shall be employed even at union wages. They demand that the employer shall help them to force his employees into the unions. In this very usual demand for the clothes shop or union shop, the public can see very little justice. The union shop. A union shop is a situation where everyone hired by an ununionized company must become a member of that union. This happens when a company has entered into a collective bargaining agreement negotiated by a union in a state where union shops are legal. While a company may hire non-union people for the job, it is understood those individuals will join the union as a condition of their employment. The union shop clause requiring all workers to eventually join the union is also known as the Union Security Clause. Those in union jobs need to join the union whether or not they agree with the principles of that union within 30 days of being hired. The other option employees have is to not join the union, but still pay an amount to the union equivalent to the dues. The main purpose of a union shop is to strengthen the collective bargaining position by, if through no other way, simply increasing numbers and raising money through dues. It is based on the theory that the more numbers a union has, the more influence it possesses. This should give the union a better advantage when it comes to negotiating during the collective bargaining process. A trade union is normally a fairly large organization. This means that there needs to be a convenient way to organize it. While the exact structure may vary, the two tend to follow a similar pattern. This has proven to be the best way of doing things since it makes it much easier to manage the membership in this way. Trade unions can be structured in any number of ways, and this will differ depending on the country and the industry that is involved. The most common type of unions is the ones that are formed to organize members from across an entire industry. The Auto Workers Union is a good example of this. It covers people in a variety of different jobs across the industry. Other unions may target only members who are in a specific occupation. The teachers' unions are an example of this. There are also some unions that will accept members from any occupation or industry. In most cases, the unions are divided into locals who deal with the employees in a certain area. Again, this differs from one union to another. One may have a local that handles the employees at one factory and a different local that handles the members at the factory down the street. Or it may be that the local who handle all the members in that city and possibly even state. One thing to keep in mind about unions, at least in places where they are legally allowed to exist, is that they are normally considered to be a separate legal entity. This means that the union is responsible for things like its debts rather than the members of the union. Recognition of trade union. A trade union is recognized by an employer when it negotiates agreements with employers on pay and other terms and conditions of employment on behalf of a group of workers, defined as the bargaining unit. This process is known as collective bargaining. A trade union is said to be recognized once an employer has agreed to negotiate with it on pay and working conditions on behalf of a particular group of workers. Voluntary trade union recognition. The most common way a union can gain recognition for collective bargaining purposes is by the employer simply agreeing to recognize it voluntarily. In practice, this means the union becomes recognized by the employer without using any legal procedures. Statutory trade union recognition. If an employer and trade union find that they are unable to come to a voluntary recognition agreement, a trade union can make an application for statutory recognition. This only applies where the employer, together with any associated employers, employs 21 or more workers. The International Labour Organization, ILO, conventions ratified by the government confer the rights of freedom of association on the employers and workers. The workers and employers form and register their associations and trade unions in accordance with the law. Registration of trade unions is regulated under Industrial Relations Ordinance. Code of Discipline for Registration of Trade Union. According to the said Code for Recognition, 1. The union should have at least 1 year standing. 2. They should have at least 15% of the membership of the establishment to claim recognition and 25% of the workforce to claim recognition on industrial basis. 3. When there is more than one union, the union with the largest membership will be given recognition. 4. The recognition will be valid for 2 years. 5. The unions which do not follow code of discipline will not be granted recognition. Rights and liabilities of registered trade union. The Act imposes duties and liabilities on registered trade unions. They are 1. Change of registered office. If the address is changed, notice in writing must be given to the register within 14 days of the change. The change shall be recorded in the register. 2. Change of name. Any registered trade union may change its name with the consent of not less than 2/3 of the total number of its members, and subject to the provisions of Section 25. 3. Disbursement of the trade union's funds. The registered union maintains two types of funds: general fund, political fund. Privileges of registered trade union. As per Section 13, upon registration, a trade union becomes a legal entity, and as a consequence, it gets perpetual succession and a corporate seal. It can acquire and hold movable and immovable property, contract through agents, and can sue and get sued. Under Section 15, a registered trade union has a right to establish a general fund. Under Section 16, a registered trade union has a right to establish a political fund. Subscription to this fund is not necessary for a member. Under Section 17, 18, and 19, a registered trade union gets immunity in certain criminal, civil, and contractual proceedings. Under Section 24, trade unions have the right to amalgamate. Trade unions are a voluntary organization of workers as well as employers formed to protect and promote the interest of their members. They are the most suitable organizations for balancing and improving the relations between the employer and the employees. Trade unions have made headway due to rapid industrial development. The workers come together to maintain and improve their bargaining power on wages and working conditions. The first organized trade union in India, named as Madras Labour Union, was formed in the year 1918. The origin of the passing of a Trade Unions Act in India was the historic Buckingham Mill case in 1940, in which the Madras High Court granted an interim injunction against the strike committee of the Madras Labour Union, forbidding them to induce certain workers to break their contracts of employment by refusing to return to work. Trade union leaders found that they were liable to prosecution and imprisonment for bona fide union activities, and it was felt that some legislation for the protection of trade union was necessary. In March 1921, Shri N.M. Joshi, then General Secretary of the All India Trade Union Congress, successfully moved a resolution in the Central Legislative Assembly recommending that government should introduce legislation for the registration and protection of trade unions. Opposition from employers to the adoption of such a measure was, however, so great that it was not until 1926 that the Indian Trade Unions Act was passed. Indian Trade Unions Bill 1925 had been passed by the legislature, received its assent on 25 March 1926. It came into force on 1 June 1927 as the Indian Trade Unions Act 1926, 16 of 1926. By Section 3 of the Indian Trade Unions Amendment Act 1964, 38 of 1964, the word Indian has been omitted and is now known as the Trade Unions Act 1926, 16 of 1926. This act summarizes all modalities pertaining to registration of trade union to decision of trade-related disputes. This act sets guidelines for both the workers and the industrialists. The act deals with the registration of trade unions, their rights, their liabilities, and responsibilities, as well as ensures that their funds are utilized properly. The main provisions made in this act are trade union. Trade union means any combination, whether temporary or permanent, formed primarily for the purpose of regulating the relations between workmen and employers, or between workmen, or between employers and employers, or for imposing restrictive conditions on the conduct of any trade or business, and includes any federation of two or more trade unions. Registration of trade union. The Act provides for the registration of the trade unions with the registrars of trade unions, set up in different states. For registration of a trade union, 7 or more members of the union can submit their application in the prescribed form of the Registrar of Trade Unions. Registration Certificate. On receipt of the application for registration, the registrar issues a certificate of registration in the prescribed form as a conclusive evidence of registration of that trade union. Uses of funds. The general funds of a registered trade union shall not be spent on any other objects other than specified in the Act. The Trade Unions Act 1926 has been amended from time to time, and the most important being the Trade Unions Amendment Act 2001. This act has been enacted in order to bring more transparency and to provide a greater support to trade unionism in India. Some of the salient features of the Trade Unions Amendment Act 2001 are: no trade union of workmen shall be registered unless at least 10% or 100, whichever is less, subject to a minimum of 7 workmen engaged or employed in the establishment or industry with which it is connected are the members of such trade union on the date of making of application for registration. A registration trade union of workmen shall at all times continue to have not less than 10%, or 100 of the worksmen, whichever is less, subject to a minimum of 7 persons engaged or employed in the establishment or industry with which it is connected as its members. A provision for filing an appeal before the Industrial Tribunal Labor Court in case of non-registration or for restoration of registration has been provided. The employees who have been retired or have been retrenched shall not be construed as outsiders for the purpose of holding an office in the trade union concerned. For the promotion of civic and political interest of its members, unions are authorized to set up separate political funds. The WTO's procedure for resolving trade quarrels under the Dispute Settlement Understanding is vital for enforcing the rules and therefore for ensuring that trade flows smoothly. A dispute arises when a member government believes another member government is violating an agreement or a commitment that has been made in the WTO. The authors of these agreements are the member governments themselves. The agreements are the outcome of negotiations among members. Dispute settlement. International trade rules are effective when they are properly applied. Therefore, dispute settlement mechanisms are set up in most trade agreements to ensure the agreements can be enforced and that disputes can be settled. Dispute settlement in a nutshell provides a rapid and effective means of settling disagreements on whether a country has acted in conformity with its international obligations, applies the agreements, and develops the interpretive understanding of the agreements. By preventing retaliation before a dispute settlement procedure has been completed, trade-damaging unilateral action is avoided. Regulations and penalties of trade union. Every person who, with a view to compel any other person to abstain from doing or to do any act which such other person has a legal right to do or abstain from doing wrongfully and without legal authority, uses violence to or intimidates such other person or his wife or children or injures his property, or persistently follows such other person about from place to place, or hides any tools, clothes, or other property owned or used by such other person, or deprives him of or hinders him in the use thereof, or watches or besets the house or other place where such other person resides or works or carries on business, or happens to be, or the approach to such house or place. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learned in this lecture. A trade union is an organization of employees formed on a continuous basis for the purpose of securing diverse range of benefits. Trade unionism is a worldwide movement, and the highly strategic position occupied by trade unions in modern industrial society has been widely recognized. The term organized labor is used to distinguish workers, employees who are members of trade unions, or employee association from those who are unorganized, example, who are not members of any union. Trade unions are voluntary organization of workers formed to promote and protect their interests through collective action. Trade union, also called labor union, association of laborers in a particular trade, industry, or company, created for the purpose of securing improvements in pay, benefits, working conditions, or social and political status through collective bargaining.